Thank you very much for taking the time to be here for our quarterly Global Student Flows briefing. My name is Sarah Verkinova. I'm Head of International Education at Bonard, and I will be guiding you through today's session. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Dave Amor, who will be sharing his expertise during the webinar on the UK. So just let me share my screen. So we have a few housekeeping notes. We'll have an open Q&A session, and we will also monitor your questions throughout the webinar, so please feel free to submit them at any time. A recording of the session and a copy of the slides will be shared with all of the participants after the end of the webinar. And we, of course, encourage you to connect with us after the session if you have further questions or would like to continue the conversations. Lastly, we will be also running one poll question during the webinar, so as always, your inputs will be really much appreciated. And before we dive into today's content, I would like to really briefly introduce Bonard for those of you who might be new to our work. So Bonard is a market data and strategic advisory firm active in the international education sector for past 18 years. We specialize in the market research and the recruitment solutions, working with government, sector associations, individual universities, and investors. And our core expertise lies in tracking international student mobility flows and identifying the trends and growth opportunities for our partners and clients. So over past years, we have developed tool and benchmarking analytics to help institutions navigate a complex international education landscape. And a major innovation is our interactive data platform, which merge enrollment and student visa data with the source market insights, which basically helped identifying high potential markets and validate, for instance, your target countries or recruitment targets as well. This webinar series supports institutions in making timely recruitment decisions and optimizing resource allocation without really waiting for years for final enrollment data for the specific destination where you are located. And we actually understand that the student visa data is now really a critical indicator, right? Therefore, our goal is to help you to understand the trends, approval rates, and what they suggest about the future enrollment. And our interactive Bonard platform, at the moment, we actually tracked over 150 source countries, helping institutions spot the growth markets, favorable conditions, and emerging enrollment patterns. And this even supports forecasting and then recruitment planning as well. So Bonard platform also offers performance benchmarks across different destinations, helping refine marketing strategies and focus on markets with higher visa success rates. And because visa data is updated quarterly, institutions can really adjust strategies in near real time based on current trends. I would like to a little bit share more about the methodology and the benchmarks that will be presented today, because these data is based on customized data set that focus specifically on the data that includes student visa grants for all study levels, covering main offshore applicants and excludes extensions. So during the webinar, we will have a look at student visa grant data at the macro level across all study levels. And then on our platform, if you are interested, the users can drill down by destinations and individual study levels. All data is sourced from official government bodies with dataset purchased and customized for accurate like-to-like comparisons. So without further ado, let's dive into the performance trends from Q1 2025 and what these indicate for student enrollment going forward. But there is one last thing I would like to highlight, and this is our poll question we would like to ask you. And this is we would like to ask you, which markets are you considering recruiting from to diversify the risk in your upcoming recruitment efforts? This is even indication for us to understand how the individual institutions are really trying to diversify their recruitment efforts, and at the same time, for the future editions of the webinars, we can even navigate and share more insights from the individual source markets based on the results of the poll question. So moving to the next, on the following slide, we are reviewing the recent performance of the major international study destinations using the student visa grant data as a key indicator. And as you can see, what stands out clearly is the significant impact that recent visa and immigration policy changes have had on international student mobility. So in the first quarter of 2025, there were at least 232,000 student visa applications across the 5 key study destinations, representing actually a 31% decline compared to the same period of 2024. Among these destinations, you can see that UK led the group, issuing 48,000 student visas. And this was largely driven by the higher education segment, with 73% of visa granted to students enrolling in master programs. But when having a look at the year-on-year performance of individual destinations, when we are comparing the first quarter 2024 and 2025, you can see that New Zealand maintained a stable trajectory overall, right? So, and actually with a modest 5% year-on-year increase in the higher education sector during the first quarter of 2025. On the other hand, there is Canada, which experienced consistent declines across all quarters, largely due to the introduction of study permit caps in early 2024, and this downward trend culminated in a sharp 70% drop during the first quarter of 2025. The UK, despite the expectations of gaining market share, underperformed throughout the 2024, and after 5 consecutive quarters of decline, in a Q4 2024 actually showed a slight rebound, primarily driven by growth in Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. However, we saw that during the first quarter of 2025, gains in India and Nigeria were offset by continued decline from China. In the United States, political uncertainty began to impact student visa numbers starting already during the second quarter of 2024, and by first quarter of 2025, the number of F1 visas has dropped by 12%, really signaling the mounting recruitment challenges and ongoing challenges for educators located in the US. But now let's take a quick look at the student visa grant rates across 4 major study destinations to really understand how approval trends are shaping international recruitment efforts. So for Australia, you can see that after showing a brief recovery in the last quarter of 2024, grant rates in Australia have since fallen back to lower levels. We see that this ongoing volatility continues to impact the institution's ability to really plan with more confidence. Canada, as you can see, remains a concern as it continues to record really consistently low grant rates, especially in comparison with other major destinations. On the more positive note, New Zealand has shown an improvement in the grant rates following the 3 consecutive quarters of declines. For the UK, we see that UK continues to stand out with a consistently high grant rates, offering really a sense of stability for both institutions and prospective students at the moment and in the coming quarter. While the US does not publish the official visa grant rate data, open sources at the moment estimate and suggest that there is a decline to 59% of the approval rate for international students. And this also points to increasing challenges in visa approvals, even though complete transparency is lacking at the moment. When we move to the next, and since our platform is even providing the destination benchmarks, so we are able to see what have been the fastest growing market during the first quarter across different destinations. And we see some variation across destinations, right? So, however, there is actually one standout, which is Nepal, as you can see, which has emerged as one of the important driver of growth across multiple destinations, with the exception of Canada at the moment. Vietnam continues to also perform quite well, particularly in the United States, where it remains one of the most reliable and consistent growth markets. And in case of New Zealand, you might notice that the fastest growing market for providers on all study levels was Sri Lanka, which continued to driving the growth from the last quarter of 2024. And these trends really highlight how certain source markets are really becoming increasingly influential in shaping the global mobility and the international education landscape. But let's have a look into the individual destinations, because I assume that this is going to be quite on your interest. So starting with the US, we see that Trump administration policies have had a clear and lasting impact, leading to really a sharp decline in international student interest in the United States. And when we look at the top source markets, you can see that both China and India, the two top leading countries, experienced a decline during the first quarter of 2025. We are talking about the combined drop of more than 3,300 fewer student visa grants compared to the same quarter of 2024. And despite this, there were several markets showing positive growth during the first quarter of this year. Notably, we saw increases coming from Nepal, Vietnam, Italy, and Pakistan. But when we translate this in absolute terms, we saw that 600 more student visas were granted to Nepalese students during the first quarter of this year compared to the corresponding quarter of the 2024. But looking ahead, there are short-term indicators that are concerning, right? So international students are now really likely to defer their US study plans, while almost 1/3 are also considering canceling altogether. And as a result, we see that many students are shifting their intention and attention as well to the markets like UK, Europe as a emerging study destination, and Asia, especially towards Malaysia, Singapore, and also Japan and South Korea. Moving to Australia, during the first quarter of 2025, we saw that the most significant decline occurred in the higher education segment. Between Q1 2024 and Q1 2025, there were 12,000 fewer student visas issued, specifically in this higher education segment. And this decline was mirrored by a drop in approximately 24,000 of visa applications, really indicating a substantial softening in demand. But again, on a more positive note, we observed a stable but modest year-on-year growth from markets such as Bangladesh, Nepal, or the Philippines. While these markets continue to contribute to the student flows, we see that growth remains relatively limited in a scale. The largest single country decline was seen from China, right, with over 6,100 fewer student visas grants compared to the corresponding quarter of 2024. And we know that many students at the moment from China are currently exploring more affordable regional alternatives, so staying within the region, including Malaysia and Singapore, and even now considering the destinations like Europe, which will be contributing again to this downward trend from the market. When we go to Canada, and even what we shared during the initial slides from the macro perspective, we saw that Canada experienced the most significant overall decline among the major study destinations. While we saw that during the first quarter of 2024, Canada recorded really a historic high in student visa issuance to Indian students, which was nearly 40,000 student visa or study permit grants. This dropped dramatically to just over 4,000 study permits granted during the first quarter of 2025, marking really a steepest decline across all of the source markets. On the other hand, again, there are some markets that had been in gradual decline throughout 2024 and showed actually signs of recovery in early 2025. And we are particularly talking about Japan and South Korea. These two markets have been recovering slowly over 2023 and 2024, and their recent growth might actually also indicate some potential turning point. So these are the markets we, even from our end, we will monitor further to see what are going to be development, especially for the second quarter of 2025, to really see like what is going to be the impact on the fall enrollment 2025. Moving to New Zealand, and this is one of those markets which have really like positive trajectory at the moment. When we see the number of student visa applications remain relatively stable between the first quarter 2024 and first quarter of 2025. While the overall volume is smaller compared to the larger destinations like UK, Canada, and the US, we saw that most key source markets, with the exception of China, showed actually growth during this period. As you can see, Nepal ranked third with almost 400 more student visa grants, although lower in the absolute numbers. It's actually represented an increase of 127% between Q1 2024 and Q1 2025, highlighting really a strong momentum for the market in general. As expected, we see that much of this growth is being driven by Asian markets, which have traditionally played a central role in New Zealand's international student recruitment. However, there is also worth noting that Brazil, as a source market, despite the contributing smaller volumes, also experienced a growth during the first quarter of 2025. And according even to the feedback from the local stakeholders, we see that New Zealand is also gaining attraction among these students from Brazil, thanks to the more favorable visa policies and affordability of study programs. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Dave, to go over the UK and share the insights.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, thanks for joining and listening, everyone. Some fascinating context coming at this from a UK perspective. What will the impacts of changes to other nations be? As we're very driven by higher education enrolments in the UK, I guess I see the impact of the United States being perhaps most significant. Australia, whilst there's some changeable scenarios overall, the HE enrolments I don't expect to vary too much. Canada, slightly different profile to the UK, still a relatively high proportion going to colleges and looking for long-term immigration opportunity. And then I guess New Zealand, a smaller country, but perhaps giving us an example of what might be happening if the main English language speaking destinations weren't busy self-sabotaging with tricky political decisions and environments for international students. So yes, I'd say for UK-based institutions, my eyes are keenly on the US and what's happening there. I guess where we can see some kind of early examples of changes that might be happening. And of course, there's a lot still to come that we'll be seeing when Q2 comes, but we need to be responding to this now and being guided by some of the news and bits of evidence that we can gather. So yes, China down, India will expect that to decline as well for the US. And then I guess what we're seeing in the Q1 data is that Latin America already starting to shift in terms of destinations that they're looking at and broadening that. East Asia more broadly. And then I guess one not to ignore is North America. So that's Canada. And then, of course, the United States itself and the citizens that will be seeking alternative destinations because of their unhappiness with domestic politics. On the UK side, yes, in Q1 we won't yet have seen the impact of the white paper, which of course is still a white paper, although we will expect many aspects of it to come through in some format. Particularly, I think it feels a given that the graduate route will be reduced to 18 months. And there's, in all likelihood, going to be further restrictions or tightening up of visa success rates and the agent quality framework. So um, I expect to see a bit of a squeeze in terms of those nationalities that typically are slightly higher risk. Um, and that we'll see evidence of what's coming through a little bit more clearly in Q2. But I guess keeping an eye on those kind of visa success rates will be important for a lot of institutions that are currently more dependent on those nationalities, and I'd encourage people to make sure they have an opportunity to monitor their own performance and look to benchmark that more widely to keep themselves safe and secure as and when tighter regulations are brought in. But if we look at Q1 as a whole, it's good news for the UK in many respects. A significant increase on Q1 2024. We're not up at 22 or 23 levels, but we are back above Q1 2021. And it's obviously good and important for UK institutions to see the reversing of that trend. If we look at sort of individual markets, yes, there's some decline in the Q1 data from China. But because of the nature of Q1 in the UK, I think a lot of that will be driven by the continued sort of more extreme dividing of the China market towards very highly ranked universities who traditionally don't offer Q1 intakes. So that's the predominant driver of declines there. If we're looking at the 12-month kind of rolling visa situation for China, it is down by about 5%, and that I think is just reflective of pressures on the outbound market from China as a whole, economic pressures, but also competition coming from other parts of the world. Um, yeah, I think Sarah, if we move on to the next slide. Yeah, if we're looking at these visa grant rates, like we mentioned before, I think there aren't massive shifts, but if we are preparing ourselves for a world in which visa regulations might be even tighter, then as I mentioned before, keeping an eye on those countries where visa success rates are declining is important. I would also highlight that traditionally Q4 and Q1 visa rejection rates are slightly higher than the overall yearly average. And that is probably down to a combination of them predominantly being students from higher risk countries, but also, and I'm hypothesizing here, but because of the type of institutions that they're going to and the fee rates, it goes beyond just the dynamic of the countries that they're coming from. So there's probably an element of risks around financial evidence coming through from students who are going to slightly lower cost institutions. But yeah, one to keep an eye on, and we'll be monitoring this closely as we see the initial impacts of the white paper news folding through into Q2, and we're available to give people advice if they have questions on what they think they should be doing, where they should be focusing now. One other item that Sarah and I were looking at yesterday to be aware of, it won't impact your UK VI license, but do be wary of, yeah, if you're in the business of issuing short-term study visas, because we were having a quick glimpse at was it Pakistan and Sri Lanka on the short-term study visa applications from Q1, and there was nearly 3,000 applications from the two countries, and the the number of successful applications was 3. So there's definitely something going on with the short-term study visa. So just be a bit wary if people are asking you to offer that to students from those higher risk countries, and do keep tabs and be aware of the risks associated with countries and visa types that you're choosing to focus on. Right, I think we can go on to the next one now. Yeah, if we're looking at from a study level basis, I mean, pre-sessional English, it's a small quarter for pre-sessional English. So whilst we try not to read too much into it, obviously it's a negative story. And if you look at that 25%, it is decline is of course predominantly driven by China, the largest pre-sessional provider by a long margin still to this day, despite a lot of them still doing pre-sessional in China and not requiring a visa for it. But China down 33% on Q1, whereas the rest of the world down about 10%. So kind of slightly mixed story there. If we look at below bachelors, quite impressive. It's a pressure that, a segment that's been under pressure for some time recently. If we go back pre-pandemic, then China was far and away the dominant country, coming in at below bachelor's levels, with a lot of the kind of pathway sector active there. But in recent years, we've seen a strong surge in interest from South Asia and the Middle East, and China, on a continued slightly downward trend. But it's very positive to see the below bachelor's numbers rising slightly there. Moving across to bachelor's, you know, some of the growth there we hypothesize is from a trend to some additional, flexibility around bachelor's entry, that's been impacting that below bachelor's segment. But yes, Nepal is the single biggest driver of that growth. So if you're not sort of actively recruiting for undergraduates in Nepal, you are missing a trick. And then what we're seeing, elsewhere is kind of the emergence and, quite decent growth from sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and South Asia, with the exception of India, where there were some slight declines in Q1 25 versus Q1 24. Yeah, masters, I mean, yeah, phenomenal growth, really. And this, is being driven predominantly by Nigeria and and India. But yes, again, we see other key markets in sub-Saharan Africa performing strongly there as well. And a quick word on doctoral. It's, a relatively small segment. So this 7% decline is not good, and certainly not on the back of a sort of a longer term trend for declines in doctoral level study. But yes, unfortunately, there the biggest declines are driven by China, which is the number one market for doctoral study, and down about 10% year over year. So, things for people to think about, I guess, from a recruitment perspective is how does your portfolio and your market-based resource stack up, for effective recruiting into Q1 and into Q2? Are there opportunities that you can be maybe engaging with departments and specific programs on, in relation to broadening that offer? We know that, historically, that the more start dates you have available, that greater flexibility, there will be opportunities to pick up additional student enrollments if you can be successful in developing those programs and targeting them to where the opportunity lies. Right. Yes. Next one. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. I mean, not too much for you to say there. I think we've covered that in some detail already. But yes, South Asia, some activity from sub-Saharan Africa, and then high volume markets. We can see the United States appearing down there, and then emerging markets. Yes, some growth from Kenya there, Uzbekistan, has been on everyone's lips of late, and very strong growth from Iraq. Though, of course, a slight word of caution there is that Iraq, Yemen, Iran have been subject to slightly sort of higher rates of visa rejections of late. Yeah, so if we can move to the next one, Sarah. Yeah, again, so having a look at these key markets, the top source markets, the growing ones, important to look at your portfolio of programs, how you perform from these markets, and to retain, some agility in your student recruitment strategy, and to have data points, that allow you to justify and make cases for relative rapid adjustment of resource and deployment of activities and actions that can allow you to take advantage of the movements in student flows and ensure that you're at the forefront of those who are taking fast and sort of decisive action to support their own institutions. Student recruitment, I think of it, a little bit like a recipe. There are key data points that you absolutely must have, and ideally, as many as possible. But you've got to be realistic about, how many data points you can effectively use. Do you have the resource to analyze them? And do you have the capability to adjust and change your strategy fast enough? But do make sure you're drawing on a good range of resources, and when you're taking actions, not always to be driven, by the short-term prospects, but also to look, medium and longer term as you evolve your strategy to try and create something that isn't overly chaotic and does allow you to build whilst addressing those short-term actions and opportunities. So yeah, I think that's about it from me for now, and I'll hand back over to Sarah to sum up. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave, for really insightful comments on the UK and what you anticipate in the coming month as well. So just to continue and sum it up, since we went through all of the destinations we currently cover, while we have provided more destination-specific insights, it's also, I think, important to take a step back and examine the broader shifts in the student flows and the preferences during the first quarter of 2025, especially in light of recent government and visa policy changes across the key markets. And I said during the webinar, we saw that Nepal really stands out with a promising performance during the first quarter of this year, emerging as one of the most dynamic growth markets across multiple destinations. Then you can see that India showed a more mixed pattern with notable growth in New Zealand and the UK, but continued significant declines in other destinations, particularly in Canada. Nigeria also recorded mixed results, while performance varied by destinations. It continues to perform strongly for the UK, as Dave also mentioned during the presentation. And we also saw a solid and steady growth from Bangladesh and South Korea, and stable performance from Indonesia, reinforcing their roles as a really reliable source market for study destinations. In contrast, Latin American markets continue to face really high challenges, largely due to ongoing issues with visa processing and approval timelines, which are limiting their outbound mobility at the moment. But what we anticipate for 2025 and project and kind of forecast, we see, of course, that the global demand for international education really continues to rise, and it's supported by expansion of diverse really study modes such as transnational education, hybrid learning, and intra-regional mobility, particularly in Asia and MENA region. At the same time, growing interest towards the Europe as a study destination, where we're already hearing from educators that there is the growing demand and the rise of the number of applications across different source markets like Bangladesh, Nigeria as well. At the same time, we see, of course, that students are adapting to and adapting more quickly to these regulatory changes, right? So influenced by a broader array of study options and increasingly awareness of alternatives beyond and traditional destinations. While the big four destinations really remain dominant, they are facing challenges that could lead and decline up to 20% in student visa grants, primarily due to the policy changes and reputation concerns. So for Australia, Canada, and the US, there is the projected to experience a decline of between 20 to 30% in visa approvals and student demand, driven by really tightening the regulations and policy uncertainty. As said, the UK appears to be kind of stabilizing, although student visa volumes might remain below the 2022 and 2023 levels. Meanwhile, intra-regional student mobility in Asia and the Middle East is really gaining the momentum, fueled by the regional cooperation, affordability, and an increasing institutional capacity across the individual regions. And we even examined like how the share of 15 largest source markets globally is going to evolve during the upcoming year. And we saw that while in 2024, it actually accounted for 68% of the demand according to student visa, we anticipate it's going to grow and represent the share is going to grow to between 72 to 74% of the total, specifically higher education visa applications until end of the 2025, when we are talking about student visa applications around 900,000 applications across these markets. And this is probably where I finish the presentation. And I would like to ask the Bonar team whether they could provide us with the result of the poll questions, if that might be possible. All right then. So we saw. I do hope that everyone can see right the results. They can get the yes. So we saw that majority of our participants, of 23% of these, choose Brazil, which they will focus their diversification efforts. Followed closely by Vietnam and South Korea, both accounting for 19% of these. And 10% of the respondents actually going beyond of our list of the markets. So we'll be actually eager to hear like what are your plans and what are the markets that you will be your plan to target with your recruitment diversification efforts. And at the same time, we saw that 6% of participants do not plan to pursue this strategy of the diversification. I assume that some of you already might have some strategies in place. So thank you very much for sharing these insights. It's much appreciated, and we will be happy to share more intel for the upcoming webinars, source countries specifically, to these about these markets that have like highest rank among the respondents, to provide you like really insight and recruitment recommendations to tap into the market. And now I would like to open the Q&A session. If we have any questions in the Q&A. And I see that we have one asking on any insight of Eastern Europe as a destination for students from across the world. So perhaps I can answer the question since what we see that there is actually even the growing demand for Eastern Europe as a study destination, generally in Europe, but of course Eastern Europe, also the Central Europe, as I said, like we saw that there is growing demand coming from Bangladesh students, because this is something which becomes like more as affordable options for many international students in terms of prices of the tuitions. So definitely this is something what we currently see and anticipate that it's going to be growth in the 2025 and moving forward as well. I see that. Okay, to answer actually Barbara's question, we can go back to the slide, but we will be sharing the full slide deck after the webinar. So hopefully that's gonna be sufficient for you. So you will receive the full deck of it. And I do hope, if there is no other question. Okay, we have actually one more question asking on the English language market to the US from Todd. At the moment, we just released in collaboration with the English USA the report on English language programs in the US, and I see that my colleague Ivana, who is in charge of the report, is at the moment typing the answer. So I will leave it up to her to provide the response to you, since she is much more skilled on the segment and the topic. But of course, we'll be happy to share more insights on this area as well. All right then. So since if there are no other questions, and we are slowly approaching the time of concluding the webinar, I would like to really express my thanks to all of you for your participation in today's webinar. I think in today's discussion, we really highlighted the importance of data, and we hope that this information really equips you with better tools for recruitment planning and helps strengthen your engagement with this really dynamic community of educators. And of course, for further information, data, and ongoing insights, please feel free to reach out to us at education@bonard.com. Follow also our LinkedIn page at Bonard Education, or visit our website, bonardeducation.com, where we regularly also share the latest industry updates and our ongoing work. And to sum it up, once again, thank you. And I wish you a really lovely day. And we hope that we will see you for the next and upcoming quarterly webinar during the Q3. Thank you.